A brutal murder, a bizarre ransom note, a family shrouded in secrets. Decades have passed, and even with new investigations, the JonBenet Ramsey case remains unsolved. But what if some evidence had revealed the truth from the very beginning? Imagine waking up the morning after Christmas to discover your 6-year-old daughter is missing. The panic, the confusion, the frantic search throughout the house. Now imagine that shortly afterward, you find your own son in the basement, lifeless. This is the story of JonBenet Ramsey, a little girl who should have been opening Christmas presents, but instead became one of the greatest criminal mysteries in history. The first thing that catches the eye in this case is the ransom note. 3 pages of handwritten text with a strange, almost theatrical tone. The demanded amount, almost exactly the value of the annual bonus that John Ramsey had received at work. The crime scene, instead of being preserved for forensic analysis, was completely compromised. People came and went from the house, tampering with evidence, and John Ramsey even picked up his daughter's body before the investigators arrived. And then comes the strangest detail of all. There were no clear signs of an intruder, no footprints in the snow, no broken doors. If there was no intruder, then only one question remains. Who was inside that house that night? From the very beginning, experts pointed out that something didn't add up. And as the years went by, some evidence began to point to an unexpected suspect, the girl's own parents. The FBI, criminal profilers, and independent investigators analyzed every detail, every inconsistency. And some of this evidence is so impactful that it is hard to ignore. Could it be that the truth was always there, but we never wanted to see it? Now let's look at the 5 most shocking pieces of evidence that put John and Patsy Ramsey at the center of the suspicions. Most kidnapping cases follow a well-defined pattern. Someone breaks into a house, takes the victim, and disappears quickly. But in the case of JonBenet Ramsey, that pattern simply does not exist. If kidnappers enter and leave as quickly as possible, why would the supposed kidnapper stop to write an almost 3-page ransom note, and worse, inside the victim's own house? If Madeleine McCann disappeared without leaving a trace, as happens in so many child abduction cases, why was JonBenet's body found inside her own home? And why did the ransom note seem to have been written by someone who crime committed by a stranger ends up pointing in a completely different direction? FBI experts analyzed the note and reached a disturbing conclusion. Everything points to it having been written by someone trying to cover something up, not by a real kidnapper. And then comes the most shocking discovery. When Patsy Ramsey was asked to provide handwriting samples for analysis, experts found glaring similarities between her writing and that of the note. What does this mean? If the parents themselves were behind this note, what else could have been manipulated at that crime scene? Now let's take a deep dive into how this case may have been much more than a simple kidnapping. The murder of JonBenet Ramsey was a crime that shocked the world. But the real mystery isn't just in what happened that night, it's in everything that came afterward. The investigation was a disaster. From the moment the police arrived at the Ramsey house, mistakes were made. No tape was placed to cordon off the crime scene. People came and went without any control. And then came the moment that changed everything. A few hours after the police arrived, John Ramsey went down to the basement, found his daughter's body, and picked her up. With that, any possible forensic evidence was contaminated. Furthermore, the Ramseys quickly hired lawyers and avoided being interrogated separately. To the investigators, this behavior wasn't that of desperate parents seeking justice, but rather of people trying to control the narrative. And meanwhile, the media turned the case into a true spectacle. Theories began to multiply. Some believed that the real culprit was still at large. Others were convinced that the crime was committed inside the house and covered up by the parents themselves. Either way, the truth was buried among contradictions, contaminated evidence, and a media circus that derailed the investigation. But there is one detail that may have been overlooked, something that was right there, but never analyzed carefully enough. And it is precisely that detail that could completely change the way we view this case. In the audio of the emergency call, Patsy Ramsey sounds hysterical, desperately screaming for her daughter. But when the call should have been ended, the line stayed open for several seconds. And then, something bizarre happens. Investigators who analyze the audio claim that you can hear voices in the background. And among those voices, one might be that of Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's older brother. The problem? The parents claim that Burke was asleep the entire night. If he was actually awake, what else might have been hidden in that house? Now let's look at the 5 most shocking pieces of evidence that could reveal the truth about this crime. The JonBenet Ramsey case is surrounded by mysteries, but some evidence speaks louder than others. Now let's analyze the 5 most impactful pieces of evidence that put John and Patsy Ramsey at the center of the suspicions. And the first of these is a clue that was right in front of our eyes from the beginning. Imagine a kidnapping. You break into a house in the middle of the night, grab the victim, and need to flee as quickly as possible. Every second counts. So why would someone stop to write an almost 3-page ransom note inside the very scene of the crime? That's exactly what happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. The note was found on the staircase of the house, and from the beginning it seemed strangely detailed. It began with Mr. Ramsey and demanded exactly $118,000, the amount of the annual bonus that John Ramsey had received at work that year. How could a kidnapper know that? The FBI analyzed the document and stated something shocking. Kidnappers never do that. The logic of a kidnapping is simple. Enter, grab the victim, and leave a short, direct note. A criminal would never risk being caught writing a long letter at the scene of the crime. And there's more. The note was written using paper and a pen from the Ramsey house itself. This means that whoever wrote it had the time to find the materials, sit down, and plan every word. Then came the forensic analysis. Specialist John Olson compared the handwriting on the note with that of Patsy Ramsey and found strong similarities. Moreover, initial tests indicated that Patsy could not be ruled out as the author of the note. If that is true, then the ransom note was not written by a kidnapper. It was an attempt to cover something up. But that raises another question. If John Benet was still inside the house, why would someone need to stage a kidnapping? The answer may lie in a chilling detail that emerged from the 911 call. In the early hours of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey desperately called 911. Her voice was frantic, her tone one of pure despair. She said her daughter had been kidnapped and begged for help as quickly as possible. When Patsy thought she had hung up, the phone kept recording. And in the silence that followed, investigators claimed that there are voices in the background. Forensic analysis of the audio revealed something shocking. There are 3 voices at the end of the recording. One would be John Ramsey's, another Patsy's, and the third could be that of Burke Ramsey, John Benet's older brother. But here's the problem. The parents told the police that Burke was asleep the entire night and only woke up after the police arrived. If he was awake at the time of the call, what else could have been hidden? Some experts believe that Burke may have said something crucial at that moment, something the parents tried to cover up. Some say he asked, "What are you going to do?" Or even, "What happened to her?" Either way, this audio should not exist. If Burke was awake, if there was this conversation between the parents right after the call, it means that the official version of events has flaws. Now the question is, if the parents were trying to hide something, what really happened that night? The answer might lie in the evidence found on John Benet's body. And the most chilling detail? Some of it has never been fully explained. A crime scene in a homicide case is like a puzzle. Every detail, every footprint, every misplaced object could be the missing piece to solve the mystery. But if this puzzle is tampered with, contaminated, or dismantled before experts can analyze it, the chances of uncovering the truth drop drastically. And that is exactly what happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. In the world of criminal investigations, there is a concept called the golden hour. It refers to the first few hours after a crime, the moment when evidence is still fresh, suspects might be nearby, and witnesses recall even the smallest details. According to the FBI, this window of time is decisive for solving a case. But in John Benet's case, this opportunity was completely wasted. When the police arrived at the Ramsey house, the basic crime scene protocol was not followed. The house was not cordoned off or treated as a potential homicide scene. On the contrary, family and friends came and went freely, contaminating everything around. Patsy Ramsey was in shock, but friends gathered at the house to offer support. Coffee was served, people sat on the sofa, walked through the rooms, and inadvertently destroyed any clues that might have been there. And then came the most critical mistake of all. After hours of waiting, an officer suggested that John Ramsey search the house to see if anything had been left behind. Upon opening the basement door, John found his daughter's body, but instead of letting the police do their work, he picked up John Benet and took her upstairs. With that gesture, any forensic trace that could have been collected was destroyed. Fingerprints, marks on the floor, any trace of who might have been in that basement, all of it was lost. Detectives realized too late that they were dealing with a crime and not just a kidnapping. And in that delay, perhaps, the truth slipped away forever. But while some police officers believed this was still a case of intrusion and kidnapping, others began to see something far more disturbing. From the beginning, the investigators in the case were divided between two lines of thought. On one side was Lou Smith, an experienced detective who claimed that an intruder had entered the house that night. On the other side was Jim Clemente, an FBI profiler who saw the case in a completely different light. Lou Smith believed that someone entered through the basement window, kidnapped JonBenet, and tried to take her away. But something went wrong in the process. To him, the presence of the ransom note and the way the crime scene was found indicated a crime planned by someone from the outside. But there was a problem with this theory. The basement window had untouched dust and cobwebs. There were no footprints in the snow around the house. No real evidence indicated the presence of an intruder. And that's when Jim Clemente's perspective began to gain strength. To him, nothing made sense unless you considered the possibility of a family cover-up. The ransom note was too long to have been written by a kidnapper. John and Patsy's behavior was unusual for desperate parents. And the strangest piece of evidence of all, JonBenet was found inside her own house. If someone from outside had committed this crime, why would they leave the body in the basement? The answer seemed obvious to Clemente. JonBenet should never have been found there. While the police tried to put together the pieces of this puzzle, the media turned the case into a true circus. Newspapers, TV shows, and tabloids rushed to create sensational headlines, each with its own version of the truth. In just a few days, the case was no longer just an investigation. It further hindered the search for the truth. Criminologist Mark Williams Thomas believes that when a case receives too much attention, it becomes a matter of public opinion. Police begin to be pressured to present suspects quickly. Unfounded theories gain strength. And in the midst of all this, the real evidence ends up getting lost. Then comes the most troubling question of all. What if, from the beginning, the media helped hide who was really guilty? Whether by influence or misinformation, the fact is that decades later, the truth about JonBenet Ramsey remains buried among conflicting theories, contaminated evidence, and a mystery that never reached a real conclusion. But is this the only case where family members were suspects and never punished? What can we learn by comparing this crime with other shocking cases? The JonBenet Ramsey case is not the only one where a rich and influential family found itself at the center of an unsolved mystery. There are disturbing patterns in these crimes that repeat themselves, and that might explain why, even decades later, the truth has never come to light. One of the most shocking examples is the case of Caylee Anthony. In 2008, in the United States, a 2-year-old girl disappeared. For weeks, her mother, Casey Anthony, concocted stories to justify where her daughter was. First, she said that Caylee was with a babysitter, then that the girl had been kidnapped. But when the girl's body was found in an empty lot, surrounded by duct tape and plastic bags, the truth began to emerge. The investigation revealed something strange. Casey didn't seem to behave like a desperate mother. While her daughter was missing, she went out partying, got tattoos, and lived as if nothing had happened. But just like the Ramseys, she quickly hired lawyers and avoided direct questioning. What happened next shocked the world. Despite all the evidence, Casey Anthony was acquitted by the jury. Her defense argued that there was no definitive proof of how Caylee died, and the doubt was enough to free her. Now think about the Ramsey case. A child found dead inside the house. Strange behavior from the parents. A confusing process, full of investigative errors. And in the end, no one was arrested. Is it a coincidence? Or is it that in certain cases, justice simply cannot face the reality when influential families are involved? Another disturbing example is the disappearance of baby Lisa Irwin in 2011. She vanished from her crib during the night, and the parents claimed that the house had been broken into. But as investigators began to piece things together, the couple's accounts started to change. First, they said they were asleep, then that a door had been left unlocked. Finally, inconsistencies emerged about the last time the baby was seen. Sound familiar? Criminologist David Cantor asserts that in family-related crimes, there is a psychological phenomenon of protecting the guilty. Often, those close by prefer to ignore the signs or seek other explanations because accepting the truth would be too devastating. In the Ramsey case, could this protection have come from society itself? Could the family's influence have led to the case being handled with more care than it should have been? These questions lead us to the most intriguing point of all. Could modern technology finally bring answers? Decades have passed since that December night in 1996, but the search for the truth has never ended. And now something that was once impossible can change everything. New advances in forensic technology. In the past, DNA tests were limited. Small samples could be inconclusive, and many traces simply couldn't be analyzed. But today, with techniques like genetic genealogy, a single trace of biological material can reveal the identity of a criminal even decades later. That's how the Golden State Killer case was solved. For years, he evaded justice. But in 2018, scientists used a genetic database to track down his relatives and finally found the culprit. If that worked in his case, why couldn't it work with JonBenet? Many experts believe that the answer may lie in the DNA found at the crime scene. If the collected material is reanalyzed with these new technologies, perhaps we can finally discover whether there really was an intruder in that house that night. But here's the question no one wants to ask. What if the DNA confirms that everything was always within the family? That would completely change the narrative of the case. And that is why many people believe there is resistance to having this test done. Could it be that some answers are simply too convenient to keep hidden as a mystery? Can the JonBenet Ramsey case be solved? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. As long as there are unanswered questions, this mystery will never be forgotten. The JonBenet Ramsey case remains one of the greatest criminal investigations have been reopened, but the truth remains shrouded in doubt. Will advances in forensic technology finally bring answers? Or is this just another case where the truth was buried forever? And what about Burke Ramsey's behavior? His statements and expressions raise even more suspicions, but does he really know more than he's saying? Now, I want to know your opinion. Were the Ramseys protected by money and influence, or is the real culprit still at large? Comment below. And if you enjoy investigations like this one, don't go anywhere. There's another case you need to know about, a mystery even stranger, with unexpected twists. Click here and find out. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. The truth may be closer than we think.